For more than a century, geneticists believed they knew where the Irish came from. Textbooks repeated the same story, documentaries repeated the same story, and even government-funded ancestry projects repeated the same story. Then, a team of scientists ran the most detailed DNA comparison in Irish history, pulling in genetic samples from nearly every country in Europe. What they found didn't just add a footnote to the old story, it rewrote it completely. And the answer wasn't where anyone expected. To understand why this discovery mattered so much, you first have to understand the story it replaced. For generations, the accepted version of Irish origins went something like this. Around 2,500 years ago, a wave of warrior tribes known as the Celts swept across mainland Europe, eventually crossing into the British Isles and settling in Ireland. These Celts, so the story went, brought their language, their art, their metalwork, and their genes with them, laying the foundation for what we now think of as Irish identity. It was a clean, dramatic narrative. It fit neatly into museum exhibits, school curriculums, and the kind of tourist material handed out at heritage centers across the country. The only problem was that nobody had ever actually found solid genetic evidence to support it. The first real cracks in that story appeared decades ago, when geneticists began studying the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son. Researchers, most notably a geneticist working out of Trinity College Dublin, discovered something odd. When they tracked the paternal lineage of Irish men, the results didn't point toward Central Europe, where the historical Celtic tribes were believed to have originated. Instead, the strongest genetic relatedness kept showing up in an unexpected place, the northern coast of Spain, particularly the Basque country and the region of Galicia. Irishmen carried extraordinarily high rates of a genetic marker known as haplogroup R1b, and that same marker turned up at strikingly similar frequencies among the Basque people, a population famous for being unusually isolated and genetically distinct from the rest of Europe. For a while, this became the new headline story. News outlets ran pieces suggesting the Irish were essentially cousins of the Spanish and Portuguese, that the true origin of the Irish people traced back not to Central Europe, but to the Atlantic coastline of Iberia. It was a compelling idea, and it fit with an older theory about ancient seafaring migrations following the Atlantic coast northward after the last ice age, moving from Iberia up through France into Britain, and eventually across the sea to Ireland. Archaeologists who studied the movement of ancient populations found this plausible too, since the geography made sense. If you were an ancient population moving north along the coastline in search of new land as the glaciers retreated, the natural route would follow the Atlantic seaboard, passing through what is now northern Spain before reaching the British Isles. But there was a catch, and it's a catch that a lot of the popular coverage at the time conveniently left out. Researchers studying the relationship between language and genetics kept running into a frustrating mismatch. If the Irish were genetically linked to Iberia, and the story was that Celtic culture and language arrived with these same populations, then you would expect to find genetic signatures of the historical Celts, the Iron Age tribes described by Roman writers, embedded somewhere in that Iberian connection. Instead, when scientists went looking specifically for genetic markers tied to the historical Celtic tribes, they came up empty. The genes simply weren't there in the way the story required. One archaeologist, speaking at a conference examining this exact contradiction, laid out the deeper problem. Language and genetics don't always move together. Sometimes a small group of politically dominant invaders can impose their language onto a much larger existing population without leaving much of a genetic footprint at all. This phenomenon, sometimes called elite dominance, means a conquering group might change what language everyone speaks, what gods everyone worships, even what laws everyone follows, while barely denting the underlying gene pool. The clearest example researchers pointed to was Hungary, where the modern Ottawa population speaks a language with roots stretching back to Central Asia, yet the genetic makeup of Hungarians today shows almost no connection to that Central Asian origin. The language survived. The genetic footprint of the people who brought it did not. This meant the old Celtic origin story for Ireland was, at best, incomplete, and at worst, simply wrong. The Basque connection was real, but it wasn't proof of a Celtic invasion. It was something older, something that predated the Celts entirely, a deep ancestral signal from the earliest post-Ice Age settlers who moved along the Atlantic coast thousands of years before anyone spoke a Celtic language. And because Y chromosome studies only tracked the paternal line, using a tiny sliver of the total genetic information in a human genome, researchers knew from the start that the picture was incomplete. They were looking at one narrow thread pulled from an enormous tapestry, and they knew there had to be more to see. That's where the real turning point came. Rather than relying on a single genetic marker passed down from father to son, a team of researchers based at Trinity College Dublin's Smurfit Institute of Genetics, working alongside collaborators, including the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, set out to build something far more ambitious. They wanted to create a genome-wide map of Irish ancestry, one that didn't just track one narrow genetic thread, but analyzed the full picture, using dense genetic data pulled from nearly 1,000 Irish individuals whose family roots could be traced back 4 generations to specific counties and regions across the island. Then they compared that Irish data against more than 6,000 genetic samples collected from Britain and mainland Europe. This was, by a wide margin, the most detailed genetic study of the Irish population ever conducted. Earlier research projects examining the genetics of the British Isles had almost entirely ignored Ireland, treating it as a footnote to studies focused on rural England, Scotland, and Wales. One earlier landmark study, known as the Peoples of the British, using a technique that examines shared segments of DNA between individuals, the research team was able to identify 50 distinct genetic clusters spread across Ireland and Britain, each one representing a group of people who shared unusually similar ancestry. When they focused specifically on the Irish side of the data, they found that Ireland alone could be broken down into 10 distinct, geographically defined genetic populations. 7 of these clusters carried what researchers labeled Gaelic Irish ancestry, meaning populations whose genetic signature reflected the deepest, most long-standing roots on the island. The remaining 3 clusters showed a blended ancestry, a mix of Irish and British genetic influence layered on top of that older Gaelic base. What made this level of detail so remarkable wasn't just the number of clusters. It was how precisely these genetic groupings lined up with actual geography. People from specific counties, specific coastal regions, even specific river valleys showed measurable genetic differences from neighbors just a short distance away. This was a level of resolution nobody had ever achieved for Ireland before, and it revealed something researchers hadn't fully appreciated, that despite Ireland's small size and its reputation for genetic homogeneity, the island contains a surprising amount of hidden internal structure, shaped by centuries of regional isolation and geography that limited how far people traveled to find partners in earlier centuries. But the most striking discovery in the entire study wasn't about the divisions within Ireland. It was about what showed up when researchers compared modern Irish genomes against the wider European dataset, and specifically against 2 ancient genomes, recovered from Irish archaeological sites. One from a person who lived near Belfast during the Neolithic period, roughly 5,000 years ago, and another from a person who lived on Rathlin Island off the northern coast during the Late Bronze Age, sometime between 2,000 and 1,500 years before the Common Era. Researchers had expected, going into this comparison, to find a strong genetic connection between that ancient Bronze Age individual and the people living in that same region of Ireland today. It seemed like a reasonable assumption. If populations stay relatively stable over thousands of years in a given area, you'd expect at least some lingering genetic continuity between the ancient remains and modern residents nearby. Instead, what they found was something almost nobody anticipated. The genetic signal that stood out most strongly across the wider European comparison wasn't linked to deep prehistoric roots at all. It was linked to Scandinavia, specifically to the northern and western coastal regions of Norway, the exact areas historically associated with Viking activity during the Norse Age. This was the moment the entire narrative shifted. Ireland has never lacked evidence of Viking contact. Anyone who has walked through Dublin knows the city itself was founded as a Norse trading settlement. Archaeological digs across the country have turned up Viking artifacts for well over a century. Local surnames across Ireland, including some of the most common ones in the phone book, trace directly back to Old Norse origins. Historians have never doubted that Vikings raided, settled, traded, and intermarried in Ireland for hundreds of years. What had always been missing was hard genetic proof, a clear signal buried inside the DNA of modern Irish people that could be directly traced back to that specific Norwegian coastline. Earlier genetic research had actually pointed in the opposite direction. Studies using Y chromosome data, the same narrow paternal line approach used in the earlier Basque and Iberian research, had found surprisingly little evidence of lasting Viking genetic influence in Ireland. This created a strange contradiction. Historical records, place names, archaeological finds, and surname patterns all screamed Viking presence, yet the genetic data using older methods barely registered it. For years, this mismatch puzzled researchers. How could a population with such extensive historical contact with Norse settlers show almost no genetic trace of that contact? The answer turned out to be method, not history. The lead researcher on the Irish DNA Atlas project explained that earlier studies had used less than 1% of the available genetic information contained in a human genome, and had focused exclusively on signals passed down through the paternal line. That approach, by its very design, could only capture a part of the story. If Viking men who settled in Ireland tended to have daughters as well as sons, or if their male descendants eventually died out along certain family lines while their broader genetic contribution persisted through other descendants, a Y chromosome only study could completely miss that legacy. It would be like trying to determine someone's full ancestry by looking at only one page torn out of an enormous family history book. By switching to genome-wide analysis, examining not just one narrow paternal thread, but hundreds of thousands of genetic markers spread across the entire genome, researchers were finally able to see what the Y chromosome studies had been missing. The Norwegian signal wasn't subtle, it was one of the strongest and most consistent regional matches found anywhere in the entire European comparison. Modern Irish genomes carried a measurable, statistically significant genetic imprint tracing back to the western coastal regions of Norway, the historical heartland of Viking raiding and settlement activity during the 9th through 11th centuries. This finding didn't erase the earlier Basque and Iberian research. Both signals turned out to be real, just operating on completely different timescales and representing different chapters of Irish history. The Iberian connection reflects something ancient, a deep ancestral link stretching back to the earliest post-glacial settlers who moved along the Atlantic coastline thousands of years before recorded history. The Norwegian connection, by contrast, reflects something far more recent and specific, a direct genetic footprint left by Norse settlers and raiders who arrived in Ireland within the last 1,200 years, well within the span of written historical record. What made the Norway finding especially significant was its geographic precision. Researchers weren't just finding a vague, generalized Scandinavian signal scattered across the entire Norse world. The genetic match pointed specifically toward the north and west coasts of Norway, the exact regions historians already knew were the primary, launching points for Viking voyages westward across the North Sea toward Britain and Ireland. In other words, the DNA wasn't just confirming that Vikings had come to Ireland in some general sense, it was pinpointing almost exactly which part of Norway many of those Vikings had come from, matching genetic data against historical geography with a level of precision that surprised even the researchers running the study. Once this Norwegian signal was confirmed, researchers turned to understanding how that Viking ancestry was distributed across the island. Not every region of Ireland absorbed Norse genetic influence equally. Coastal areas linked to major Viking settlements, particularly around Dublin and other early Norse trading. Towns showed noticeably higher concentrations of this Scandinavian signature compared to more inland, historically isolated regions further west. This regional variation lined up almost perfectly with the historical record of where Viking settlements were established, reinforcing just how accurately genetic data could now trace specific historical migration events, not just broad prehistoric population movements. The study also uncovered something else entirely unexpected while mapping these 10 distinct genetic clusters across Ireland, something that had nothing to do with Vikings or ancient Iberian settlers at all. Running directly across the northern part of the island, researchers identified an extremely sharp genetic boundary, a dividing line separating the province of Ulster from the rest of Ireland. This wasn't a gradual genetic gradient, the kind of gentle blending you'd expect to see between neighboring populations who had mixed and intermarried gradually over centuries. It was a hard, high contrast break, almost like a wall, and it didn't stop at the provincial border. The genetic divide actually cut through Ulster itself, splitting the northwest from the northeast into genetically distinguishable populations. Researchers connected this striking internal boundary to a well-documented historical event, the Ulster plantations of the early 17th century, when the English crown organized the large-scale settlement of English and Scottish Protestant colonists onto land confiscated from Gaelic Irish landowners in the north of Ireland. This deliberate, large-scale population movement left a genetic scar that remains clearly visible in the DNA of people living in the region 4 centuries later. It stands as one of the clearest examples anywhere in the world of a specific, dated historical policy decision, leaving a permanent, measurable signature in a population's genome, still detectable using modern genetic sequencing technology centuries after the fact. Beyond tracing historical migration, this genetic mapping work carried real consequences for medical research as well. Ireland has long been recognized as having unusually high rates of certain inherited conditions compared to the rest of Europe, including cystic fibrosis, celiac disease, and a serious metabolic disorder called galactosemia, which prevents the body from properly breaking down certain sugars found in dairy products, legumes, and organ meats. Researchers have also observed a curious geographic pattern with multiple sclerosis, where prevalence increases the further north you travel across both Ireland and the United Kingdom, a pattern strongly suggesting that population genetics may directly influence disease risk, depending on where in Ireland someone's ancestors happen to be from. This connection between geography, ancestry, and disease risk is one of the primary reasons researchers pursued such a detailed region-by-region genetic map of Ireland in the first place. Ireland's geographic isolation as an island, combined with centuries of relatively limited immigration compared to mainland Europe, created ideal conditions for certain genetic variants to become concentrated within specific communities. Understanding how that concentration happened and why those patterns exist has real implications for medical screening and disease research, not just for people living in Ireland today, but for the tens of millions who can trace part of their ancestry back to the island. The research didn't stop with that original landmark study either. In more recent years, scientists have returned to this same genetic dataset using newer, more sophisticated analytical techniques. A follow-up study published in the European Journal of Human Genetics expanded the sample size significantly, analyzing genetic data from more than 6,500 individuals with documented regional ancestry across both Ireland and Britain. Using an advanced computational method called Leiden community detection, originally developed for analyzing complex network structures, researchers were able to identify genetic communities with even greater precision than before, while also reconstructing a detailed timeline of when different waves of genetic mixing actually occurred. This newer analysis confirmed and deepened many of the original findings. It found that populations across Ireland showed modestly but consistently elevated levels of genetic relatedness within their own regions compared to England, suggesting certain Irish communities remained relatively isolated from outside genetic influence for longer stretches of history than their counterparts across the Irish Sea. The study also picked up something intriguing when researchers looked at shorter segments of shared DNA which tend to reflect older genetic connections rather than recent ones. These shorter segments revealed elevated genetic sharing between Irish populations and communities in Western Scotland, Wales, the Isle of Man, and the Orkney Islands. A pattern researchers believe reflects a much older shared Gaelic and Norse Viking heritage, stretching across the Celtic Sea and Irish Sea Zone, a network of maritime cultures that stayed connected for centuries through seaborne trade, migration, and intermarriage. Interestingly, this deeper genetic relatedness with places like Western Scotland and the Isle of Man largely disappeared when researchers looked instead at longer shared DNA segments, which reflect more recent genetic connections. This kind of pattern, strong in the old data but weak in the recent data, tells researchers something important about the timing of historical contact. It suggests that the strongest waves of genetic mixing between Ireland and these neighboring Celtic and Norse-influenced regions happened much earlier in history, and that more recent centuries saw comparatively less genetic exchange between these specific populations, even though cultural and linguistic ties often remained strong. None of this research exists in isolation from the broader question of Irish identity, a subject that carries enormous emotional and cultural weight, both for people living on the island today and for the global diaspora descended from Irish immigrants who left the country over the centuries, especially during the devastating famine years of the 1840s, when mass starvation triggered one of the largest emigration waves in European history. Millions left Ireland during that period alone, carrying their genetic heritage to the United States, Canada, Australia, and countless other corners of the world. Today, people who claim Irish ancestry vastly outnumber the population actually living on the island, which makes the question of what Irish DNA represents and where it traces back to something that resonates far beyond Ireland's borders. What this research ultimately reveals is that there was never a single simple answer to the question of Irish origins, no matter how badly popular culture wanted one. The old Celtic invasion story, the one taught for generations, turns out to be largely a myth, at least in genetic terms. There is no clear genetic signature in Ireland that can be traced specifically back to the historical Celtic tribes, described by ancient writers. The language arrived, the culture arrived. The genes carrying that specific historical identity, as far as scientists can tell, either never arrived in significant numbers or were absorbed so thoroughly into the existing population that they became genetically undetectable. Instead, the real genetic story of Ireland is layered, built from multiple distinct waves of ancestry stacked on top of one another across thousands of years. At the deepest layer sits an ancient connection to populations who migrated along the Atlantic coastline after the retreat of the glaciers, a connection that still echoes today in the genetic similarities between the Irish and populations in northern Spain, particularly the Basque region and Galicia. Above that sits a Bronze Age foundation established roughly 3,500 years ago, which researchers believe represents the point at which the core modern Irish genetic landscape was largely established. Layered on top of that sits the more recent, historically documented Viking contribution, concentrated most heavily along the coasts and in regions with historical Norse settlements, tracing back specifically to the northern and western coastal regions of Norway. And finally, sitting closest to the surface, are the genetic scars of more recent historical events, like the Ulster plantations, still clearly visible in the DNA of people living in the north of the island today. When people ask which single region of Europe Irish DNA matches most closely, the honest scientific answer depends entirely on which layer of that history you're asking about. If you're asking about the deepest, most ancient roots, the answer points toward northern Spain, toward the Basque country in Galicia, reflecting a migration that predates recorded history entirely. If you're asking about the most statistically distinct, geographically specific match uncovered in the most detailed and comprehensive genetic study ever conducted on the Irish population, the answer points somewhere far less expected, somewhere long dismissed by earlier, less thorough genetic research. It points toward the rugged, windswept coastline of western Norway, the same coastline that once launched the ships of raiders and settlers who left far more of a genetic mark on Ireland than anyone, using the tools available at the time, had ever been able to prove. That's the real story hiding behind the headline. Not a simple, single answer wrapped up in a neat bow, but a genetic record layered like sediment, each wave of history leaving its own distinct mark, waiting for the right tools and the right level of detail to finally bring it into focus. For over 100 years, the accepted story of Irish origins was treated as settled, finished, closed. It took a genome-wide comparison against thousands of samples from across the entire European continent to prove just how incomplete that old story really was, and to reveal, hidden in plain sight inside the DNA of people living in Ireland today, a connection to a region nobody expected to find at the very top of the list. It's worth pausing here to consider just how much this kind of research has changed in a relatively short span of time. 2 decades ago, a project of this scale would have been almost impossible to carry out. Sequencing a single human genome used to take years and cost a small fortune. Comparing thousands of individuals across an entire continent, cross-sea, referencing that data against ancient remains recovered from archaeological digs, and running the computational modeling required to detect subtle regional genetic clusters, all of that depended on technology that simply didn't exist in a practical, affordable form until relatively recently. The Irish DNA Atlas project and the studies that followed it were only possible because of cheaper sequencing technology, more powerful computing, and a growing willingness among research institutions to fill gaps left by earlier, incomplete studies of the British Isles. This also explains why the story kept changing over time, and why it will likely keep changing in the years ahead. Genetics doesn't work like archaeology, where a single dramatic discovery can stand largely unchanged for decades. Genetic research is iterative. Each new study builds on the last, using larger sample sizes and more refining. D-methods to sharpen the picture a little further. The Basque connection was the accepted answer for years, built on limited Y chromosome data. Then genome-wide sequencing arrived and revealed the Norwegian signal hiding underneath it. Then Leiden community detection arrived and revealed the fine-grained timing of that Norwegian contact, along with older Gaelic and Norse connections stretching across the Irish Sea. There's no reason to think this process is finished. Ancient DNA recovery techniques keep improving, and researchers are actively working to sequence more ancient genomes from sites across Ireland, Britain, and continental Europe. Every new sample added to that comparison has the potential to shift the picture again. There's also a broader lesson buried inside this story, one that extends well beyond Ireland. Popular narratives about national or ethnic origin tend to prefer simplicity. People want a clean answer to the question of where they come from, a single ancestral homeland, a story that can be summarized in one sentence and repeated at family gatherings or printed on a tourism brochure. Actual. Population genetics almost never works that way. Every population on Earth, studied closely enough, turns out to be the product of multiple overlapping waves of migration, conquest, trade, and intermarriage, stacked on top of each other across thousands of years. Ireland is a particularly clear example of this because its island geography made it easier for researchers to draw a defined boundary around the population and study it in isolation. But the same layered complexity almost certainly exists beneath every national identity in Europe, and likely everywhere else in the world too. For the millions of people around the globe who identify as being of Irish descent, whether through recent immigration or through family trees stretching back generations to the famine era, this research offers something more valuable than a single tidy answer. It offers a genuinely evidence-based picture of where that identity actually comes from, built not on legend or assumption, but on direct comparison against real genetic data collected from real people, both living and long deceased. It shows an identity built from ancient coastal migrants moving north after the ice retreated, from Bronze Age settlers who established the genetic foundation still visible today, from Norse raiders and settlers who left a far deeper mark than anyone had proven before, and from later historical upheavals like the plantation era that reshaped entire regions within a single generation. The next time someone repeats the old line that the Irish are simply Celts or simply cousins of the Spanish, it's worth remembering just how much more complicated and how much more interesting the real answer turned out to be once scientists finally had the tools to look closely. Enough. The DNA was always there, waiting inside the genomes of people living on the island today. It just took the right study, using the right methods, comparing against the right reference points across the entire European continent, to finally read what it had been, quietly recording all along.